Yes, welcome back again. We will continue the conference now with the second session in our conference titled Safe and Dignified Return to Syria, Key to Lasting Peace and Stability in the Region. I invite moderator Paul, Sales and speakers to the podium, please.
Can I translate to her? All right. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. I hope you all had a pleasant lunch, and I hope that we are energized and ready to come back for further discussion this afternoon. The panel that we have to take us, I think, for about 90 minutes, roughly speaking, maybe a little bit less to try and keep on time, is looking in some more detail at the practical realities and challenges around the question of return, what is actually occurring in terms of people who are going back, what are the challenges they're facing, what are the experiences around that, how can some of these issues be addressed and be met, and what is the role of the key agencies and authorities trying to assist in that. On the panel we have...
Recording in progress.
On the panel we have Marwan Nazan from the Syrian Association for Citizens' Dignity, Dr. Ruba Meissen from the SAWA for Development and Aid, Alex Tyler from UNHCR, and Refik Hodzic, who is down here as a transitional justice expert. And the idea is similar to the panel that we had this morning. We will try and have as conversational an approach this afternoon to some of these issues, and I'll offer a couple of questions to each of the panelists to try and catalyse that discussion, and then we'll open it up, hopefully in about 40 minutes, for questions and comments from both you in the room and those online following the discussion. If I can begin with you, Marwan, and just to ask you, first of all, from your perspective as someone who has obviously gone from Syria to Turkey and has been there for some time, and just what do you see as the greatest obstacles in a practical way, as a tangible way for returning at the present time? And what, for you, would be the likely scenarios resulting from any kind of premature return?
Thank you, Mr. Bob. سأجيب باللغة العربية لدقة المصطلحات اللي ممكن.
I will speak in Arabic. Before responding to the question, I would like to speak a bit about the timing of a safe return. This means three things. First, the introduction, which deals with the major impediments to the return of Syrians, in addition to the definitions of all terms contained in the document, so that it should be well understood. There is the regime, there is the Syrian state, the Syrian refugee, the Syrian dissident, the Syrian displaced person. So these are the conditions that should be provided for the return of Syrians. So there is the pre-return stage in order to give the Syrians serious assurances for the return under a comprehensive solution, so that this would provide a safe return. There is also the measures during the return. As for the third stage, it is after the return, the period after the return. With regard to the obstacles impeding the return of Syrians, this is our focus on the roadmap, in the roadmap. So every Syrian would be able to return to his home and to the place he left. This has been laid down in cooperation with many other participants. We have submitted a lot of studies on the fate of the returnees. Some of them have been faced with punitive measures, and this is the main obstacle impeding the return of Syrians. So the last report on Lebanon, 80% of the displaced persons in Lebanon, they prefer to live under very difficult economic conditions, although they are completely illegal and residing illegally in Lebanon. However, they prefer to stay in Lebanon rather than returning to Syria. I am a medical doctor, and I have a lot of friends in Syria. I have a friend who never took part in any movement. He was always neutral, and he was pursuing his medical career. And he decided to return to his home a few months ago. After his arrival, 20 days after his arrival, he was detained without any justification, without any reasons. And he stayed in jail for 4 months. I think he had to pay $6,000, and he stayed for 4 months. And he was exposed to psychological violence, to physical violence, and whoever saw him later on, they found him abnormal, not back to normal. So those are people whom we know personally. Of course, we all want to go back to Syria, but we cannot be subjected to these harsh realities. There crimes have been committed against 13 million people. There are war crimes in Syria with the acknowledgement of the international community, crimes against humanity. However, he was never penalized for it. And all press releases and reports say that they're still in position. Those who perpetrated these crimes are still in their positions. So how could I ever think of going back to Syria? As for the use of chemical weapons in Syria, there have been proofs. So where is the accountability here? Russia entered in order to oversee this problem. However, we can see the destruction policy to achieve political purposes. In addition to the very poor living conditions, the hunger, the low salaries that cannot meet the basic necessities of any human being. So these are the obstacles, the main obstacles impeding the return of Syrians. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Marwan. Ruba, if I can turn to you, I think there are a couple of questions that maybe something you can give us your thoughts on. Just at the moment, from your own experience and knowledge, do you have any insights into whether or not pressure is being applied in certain countries, certain host countries, that is leading to people deciding to return? And if so, what are the implications of that? And I guess a separate question I have is more connected to early recovery, but why don't we look at that one first of all? What is the reality from your point of view about those questions of people being encouraged more than encouraged or forced to return? Is that happening, and if so, what are the implications of it?
Sure. Thank you for inviting me. I would like to start by thanking the Syrian Association for Citizen Dignity for their hard work on the issue of return since 2018, and also for inviting me to be part of this panel. I want to start by saying that, of course, there's a lot of push factors happening in host countries. I will talk about Lebanon since we are working a lot in Lebanon. The main issue about return is to really highlight the element of choice. Do you have a choice as a Syrian today to take a decision whether or not you want to go back to your country? And to unpack a little bit this element of voluntariness in return, because if you are living in a country where there is no infrastructure, difficult economic conditions, very low protection thresholds, people coming every day to threaten you in the camps. Of course, the Syrian regime has its allies and its wings in Lebanon. You don't have access to information about Syria. You don't know what your areas of origin, what's the situation in your area of origin. Is your home still viable or not? If you go back, can you get the necessary documents to access your HLP? If all of these elements, and on top of that, you are being pushed, not literally pushed to the bus, but you are being pushed daily by the government to go back to Syria. So how can we speak here about, voluntariness in return? But I would like to clarify something, because I think since the morning we have been talking about refugees as a bulk. Syrian refugees don't want this. Syrian refugees don't want to go back. Syrian refugees can't go back. And I want to unpack a little bit that every group of refugee and every single refugee is a story. So we cannot just group all of them. Some of them are deciding to come back. Again, is this decision a choice? Are they deciding, based on good access to information? Of course not. Are they, after going back, are they going to get good services are they going to be deported? Are they going to be from Lebanon? Are they going to disappear like when they go back? Like the last batch of return from Lebanon, we saw that one of the people who came back, not only a few weeks ago, was immediately detained by the Syrian regime. So we have to unpack a little bit this element of choice, and that refugees are not a whole. But we also have to remember that we are talking about the return as if really the regime wants the Syrians to return, which is not the case. What is happening today on the issue of return is very similar to what happened with the issue of amnesty back in April. I mean, it's just a stunt, a media stunt to say we are ready to receive the refugees, we are strong. In some of the interviews that were happening from people from that belonged to this regime apologetics, they were saying the proof that these people came back is a proof that Syria is for all Syrians. They wanted to show that Syria is not safe, but here Syria is safe. The president gave this amnesty, and so this is why people can return. So it's all part of this wave of reimagining and reinventing the regime once again, and telling the West that we are ready to receive these people, so give us your money. It's also part of the normalization wave that's happening now from a lot of European countries and Western countries with the regime. And let me just tell you, I just want to clarify something, because a lot of people are saying, oh, look, people are coming back from Lebanon. There's 2,000 people that registered for the first batch of return. I just want to clarify that the first batch of return now, these people are the ones who registered back before COVID. These are from the batch of people who registered when the reconciliations happened back in the day. These are not people who registered today. And among the 2,000 people that registered, or 2,500 that registered, only 1,700 got approvals to go back from the Syrian regime or the Syrian government. And out of the 1,700, only 512 eventually returned after receiving the approval from the government. So just to kind of add a little bit of nuance and unpack this, however, even the regime and the government doesn't see the refugees as people or stories. For him, the refugees is a group of people, and this group is a Sunni group from the rural. These people are groups of people who left because they had a political stance. These are groups of people, who fled from us, which means they have a political stand against us. So this is why we cannot count on the regime to treat them as humans or as individuals, because they see them as a bulk of politicized entities. And the biggest proof of that is that when people apply to go back and they are rejected, we don't have criteria based on which people are allowed to go back or not. Sometimes it's because you are from a certain family, or you are from a certain town that initiated the revolution, or sometimes without any reason at all. So we just need to stop talking about this process as if it's a very scientific process and we have all the criteria available, and because we are not dealing with a counterpart that is dealing with this in that way. I'll stop here for now.
Thanks, Ruba. Just you mentioned what I think is an interesting part, and the question of the disposition of the government in Damascus to how serious, how genuine is it? And I think we heard in the first panel the former ambassador talking about the question of really how much is it in the regime's willingness or interest to encourage returns, etc., and the degree of scepticism about that. And you mentioned there that I think you said it was could sometimes be seen as something of a stunt. And I guess one of the questions that's going on around this, you connected the question of being able to access funds through so-called normalisation. There is this ongoing discussion and tension around early recovery work, and I'm just wondering, do you have a view on the pros and cons of that work? How important, how necessary is it? How negative or otherwise can it be seen in terms of returns and encouraging returns?
Sure. So we all know now that the government in Syria doesn't have the capacity. Forget about everything security, political, because I think my colleagues already covered that in a great way. But they don't have the capacity financially to care for those who are coming back, knowing that even the closest people to the regime are now suffering from lack of services, from very terrible conditions inside. So does the regime really have today the ability to not take in 9 million people coming back, to take in 500,000 people coming back? I don't think this is the case. However, as was spoken on the last panel, it's also to start a new, it's definitely part of the new political process, saying, okay, step by step, this is an act of goodwill on our behalf. We are accepting people back. So it's definitely part of this also step for a step thing. But it's also to start attracting the reconstruction money under a different name or under a different umbrella, saying, okay, there are a lot of countries that have, a red line when it comes to reconstruction. But what about early recovery? And to be honest, if I want to come to my own reading on this, I would say we have to also be pragmatic. I know that Syria today is not safe for return. The protection thresholds haven't been met. There is no safe, voluntary, dignified, and mostly sustainable return that is happening, because we know that from the batches we've monitored in the last years, a lot of people have tried to escape again after having returned. So it's not really a sustainable return. However, whether we like it or not, a lot of people are choosing to return. And it is here that I feel like as Syrians, we need to have this nuance that the government doesn't have and the international community doesn't have, because we want to strike a balance between, yes, we don't want the reconstruction, we don't want early recovery in bulk that goes in the wrong hands, in the hands of regime cronies, etc. But at the same time, those who are coming back, whether it's forced or those who couldn't have left, etc., those are Syrians as well, and those are our brothers and sisters, and they are living in extremely difficult economic, social conditions inside Syria. So it's about finding what are the modalities that we can find with international community, by working with the community, for the community inside Syria, because there is indeed a huge need. And as much as we are committed to work in northeast and northwest Syria, we should as well be committed to work in the whole of Syria, because these are our brothers and sisters, and having stayed behind is not in itself a political stance. They are human beings as well that we should be defending them. So
thanks.
Yeah.
Thank you very much, Roba. I think both of the contributions, Alec, that we've heard so far from both Marwan and Roba kind of are good ground setting for some of the questions that I think are relevant for you. And all of the things they have discussed, of course, are relevant for you, but the fact that we shouldn't treat refugees as a kind of monolithic construct, and that there are, of course, individual stories and individual interests and appetites, and people are going back, and some people do want to go back. All of this, I think, is important and true. And I suppose Marwan's story about his friend, that raises the question, well, how safe is it, and how can we make it safe enough for that to happen frequently and predictably? I guess what I would like you to discuss a little bit is maybe a little bit from kind of first principles to some degree, what's the starting point of UNHCR's work on this issue, but also to touch a little bit, if you can, on the issues of thresholds and the preconditions that you think are important and necessary to encourage anything further. To the extent, do you think those currently exist, or what much further has to be done to develop them? And if we have time, and sorry for overloading, I suppose to discuss a little bit the capacity, whether it's yours or others, to monitor conditions effectively.
Sure, and thank you very much for the invitation to speak today. I'm going to start by just providing an example of another type of repatriation, voluntary repatriation, which has happened, just to make a comparison. Some of the colleagues here would have heard this comparison before. We discussed it at an LSE event on return, but I find it useful to distill down to what is the essential factors which guide like the principles behind the return. That is Afghanistan in 2001. Where, there was the conflict between the Northern Alliance and the Taliban, the fall of the Taliban, at least in terms of their control of and the government, and then there was an international process leading up to a major conference in Berlin, which set basically the political parameters for the future of Afghanistan, establishing a transitional federal government and a process towards elections, constitutional reform, and all of those different steps we would have hoped to have seen. It was framed by that political agreement, and working closely with the transitional federal government, they were then empowered to establish legal agreements between, say, Afghanistan and Pakistan or Afghanistan and Iran, which then defined the nature of how Afghan refugees could return. And these documents included things like everything from guarantees for their safety, included information on their housing, land, and property. It meant that if you were coming back from Pakistan, could you bring your furniture? Could you bring your property? Would you be facing customs and regulating that? It dealt with things like civil documentation, and crucially, it ensured it set into place a mechanism for monitoring that return by UNHCR and other agencies, and even by the Afghan human rights bodies, in order to follow up and try and address areas where there were the sort of agreements were not being respected, and where there were still problems, and there were many problems still in Afghanistan at that time. But even so, 3 million people voted with their feet. I mean, they came back. 3 million people came back within a very short time from Iran and Pakistan, which I think is also the other strongest indicator that that there was a hope, there was an expectation, there was a future for them, for the Afghans in Afghanistan. I'm fully aware of the irony 20 years later of what has now happened in Afghanistan. But I think that then is reflect that onto Syria. Which of those steps are in place? I mean, in terms of a legal agreement, like a political process, agreements between countries, guarantees, I mean, very few, right? So we're, but I think what those agreements and what those structures did is that it gave confidence. It redefined the relationship between the state and the Afghan people. And those sorts of steps are necessary. Those sorts of, I would say, a political agreement is not essential for people to return, right? But it is a mechanism through which that relationship can be rebuilt, and there can be guarantees of people when they return, giving people confidence to decide to return. Now, the other crucial steps are amnesties, guarantees for people's personal security, dealing with housing, land, and property, where there have been some decrees and some steps within Syria, but not to an extent which would give anybody confidence, right? And it's incredibly unpredictable as how these things are enforced, as you mentioned with your friend. Now, that sort of model is not the only one. There have been other situations where, if you think back to Vietnam 30, 40 years ago, there have been cases where there was a government in place who wasn't necessarily recognized by the international community, but there were sort of bilateral agreements made to try and ensure guarantees to people as they return. And there are other situations, such as Macedonia and Kosovo, where people just walked back, right? I mean, it was just where people just decided, I've had enough time in asylum, I want to go home. But they feel confident enough to do so, and they felt that they would be safer and better off home. Now, I think the key things here are, what are the guarantees for people, right? Irrespective of a political agreement. Are there guarantees in place which will be respected, which gives people confidence to go back? And I don't think that's really in place clearly not in Syria. The other thing is the voluntary nature of that return. If you think of the 3 million Afghans who went back, or the Kosovars who walked back on their own to Kosovo, I mean, that's clearly not the situation in the Syria situation. I was reading this SACD report on intention survey, which very broadly lines up with UNHCR's own intention surveys. We do them every year for the last 7 years. You know, the majority of people do want to go home eventually, as I think we've heard in this room, but very, very few have any intention of going back anytime soon. It was less than 2% of the total people surveyed. And for those who want to return back, they're citing the same things which you have been highlighting: personal security, guarantees, but they're also highlighting, I would say, to a similar extent, the economic situation, the lack of services, the lack of capacity. So, I mean, in this context, it's very difficult to move forward. I mean, in terms of, and you talked about a monitoring mechanism inside, or what can we do to, we do not have a framework in place which would allow UNHCR to do monitoring in any substantial, systematic way. We have other means of doing so. We, for instance, the people coming back from Lebanon recently, I agree with your analysis, that we asked people, would you mind if we contacted you inside? And sometimes we have telephone numbers, but many people say no, please don't contact us, because there was a risk of being associated with the UN calling you up inside Syria, and we have to be very respectful of that. But it remains very anecdotal. I think we, together with you, collect information through various means, including direct interviews, sources, telephone calls, other sources, and I think collectively, you know, it paints a very difficult picture inside Syria. Now, let me just go back to restate UNHCR's position on return and on the asylum in general. Now, I mean, I've seen a lot of papers which suggest that UNHCR is somehow pushing for return, or that we're somehow engaging in activities inside Syria relating to early recovery and things like that, and that would incentivize return. But so let me just answer that now. The main direction of UNHCR and the primary focus is on protecting the asylum space and protection space for refugees in neighboring countries, because according to our formal legal documents which advise asylum adjudication all over the world, the vast majority of Syrians need international protection. The vast majority need international protection, and their right to seek asylum and to be given rights in those asylum countries should be respected. Full stop. That's the main drive. Now, in addition to the right to seek asylum, people have a parallel right to return back to their country at a time of their choosing. Now, they may even decide to go back when conditions are not safe, and we counsel them against this. We talk to them about the risks that they would face. We try and make sure that the decision is well informed. But you've also highlighted how complex the pressures on people are in this context. But but when somebody comes to us and says, "Look, we do want to go back," we try and help them to return with some dignity. Now, UNHCR does not engage in anything to do with supporting return transport or anything like that. But if somebody approaches us and they need help with getting documents, because that document, the Syrian document, is necessary to be able to get past to access housing and property and things like that, we would help them, right? At the same time, we're assessing the voluntary character of return and counseling them on the risks. But then if they decide to go back on this, the GSO, the Lebanese organized transport, we'll be there present. But ultimately that's their decision, and it's their right to choose to go back. But these things are not mutually exclusive, right? It's not either you stay in asylum or you return. The basic line is that people have the right to seek asylum and they need international protection, full stop. Then some may decide to go back whenever they want to, and it's our responsibility to make sure that they're as well informed as possible. I think that the tricky factor, as you mentioned, is all these complex push factors. I mean, we're very worried by the rhetoric in Lebanon. I think that it's had a very negative effect on relationships between Syrian and Lebanese communities. I do want to emphasize how much Lebanon, Turkey, Jordan, Iraq as countries and as these communities themselves have stepped up and shown solidarity, and how for over now to 12 years, it's whilst facing their own challenges and economic and political problems. And so I think that should not be understated. But at the same time, we have to try and guard against these pressures which could encourage people to return, push people to return prematurely. You mentioned some around the sort of the tensions and you mentioned people going to camps at night and things like that. A major factor is a reduction in assistance. That's a huge factor. I would say, even and I've said this before in other conferences, the main risk driving refugee return, premature refugee return, is a drop in donor funding. And I know that's not a popular thing to say to donors, but it's true. Because then how can you expect a Jordanian government or a Lebanese government to actually talk to their own people and say, we're going to continue to provide services to the Syrian refugee, whilst they're actually not being supported to help their own Jordanian compatriots, right? It has to be a partnership between the international community and these host governments to help them to ensure the protection space and access to services and support as we go forward. And sadly, this year we're facing a significant downturn. It's in funding. It's parallel to 2015, when before there was 1 million people who moved to Europe from this region and others. The actual funding levels in the Kuwait 3 conference, the pledges there were slightly below the Brussels conference from this year. But the actual funding received is increasingly lower than in the last 4 or 5 years. And this will affect directly the welfare of people, their ability to cope with protection challenges. It will challenge the host community's capacity to host and live their own lives. But it will also affect the host government's confidence. Like, will we be left holding this responsibility without the international community stepping up? And look, I just think it's a moral obligation. It's a strategic priority, frankly, to support these host countries. And I think that certainly we and our High Commissioner has been passing this message, and we'll be again at Brussels, and hoping that we can, the Ukraine conflict is of course critical. The support needed for the Ukrainians is of course critical, but it has to be it has to be additional to the support required by other crises around the world. Otherwise, we're left in a sort of perfect storm where you have people descending further into poverty, tensions rising with host communities, people being forced back prematurely because, into a Syria which is not ready or capable of accepting them. The only other sort of trend we've seen has been these onward movements and these desperate decisions of people to leave Lebanon and move on. And we've seen the consequences of that. It's horrific. And I remember one study by it was a colleague from Jordan and Switzerland who did a study on intention surveys, and they actually found that it's much more likely that people will move on than people will return to Syria. Rather, the push factors are unlikely to result in return in that sense. It will result in descent into poverty, tensions and problems in host countries, probably instability. But it would also lead to these onward movements where people have the capacity and resources to do so. So, we need a refresh. We shouldn't sleepwalk into a sort of return operations. We need to reaffirm that right to seek asylum, the space in the host countries. We need to reaffirm the partnership between the international community and those host countries, whilst also respecting the rights of people to return to their country when they choose to do so. And I agree on your point. I'm taking too much time, but I'm going to I agree on your point on the early recovery. Look, do you know the extent of the reconstruction and investment you'll need to do inside Syria to create an incentive for people to go back? It's not going to be a school here or we're fixing a well there. This is not going to make any difference, right? We're talking major World Bank billion-dollar investments to really create a condition which would actually make people say, now's my time to go back. So I really think that I fully agree with what you're saying, that, look, we've got to help people. There are Syrians who haven't left. There are Syrians who've decided to return. Their decision has to be respected. I'm not talking about facilitating or organizing return, but like those who have gone back, and the IDPs in particular. This is who we're targeting, really. The IDPs in particular who need help need to have that support beyond just humanitarian handouts. Even then, it's not going to save the economic situation inside Syria, far from it. But at least it will make some lives inside Syria slightly better, whilst we hope we can move towards a more constructive solution to this problem.
Thanks very much, Alex. I was generating a number of questions, but you addressed everything quite comprehensively, so we may come back to them later on from the floor. One of the points you made that I think I'll turn to Refik with this question, but just to preface it, you mentioned that political agreement is not essential, but you didn't say this, but I presume you agree it would be preferable and obviously ideal without any doubt. And I'm just wondering, you've talked about the Afghan experience. You're making me feel very old because I was in and around a little bit of that Bonn discussion, and the discussions after it, as you know, in 2012, a further detailed meeting by UNHCR on what had gone well and what had gone badly on those issues, which was a point of fairly intimate reflection, let's say, on some of those issues as well. So you know very well the difficulties and challenges, and I think in many ways the Afghan experience can be instructive. But I want to turn also to the experience, Refik, if we can, in particular your own experience, but also to extrapolate a little bit from Bosnia and the approaches that were taken there and how important or otherwise the general agreement was for the, I'm asking Refik behind you, sorry, from your experience as a Bosnian refugee returning in that context, and to what degree you see similarities or usefulness for applying that to the current situation.
I think, yeah, I read the same note. I actually wrote political agreement is absolutely essential to return, not to pick a fight with Alexander.
أنا لا أود أن أتعارك مع أليكزاندر، ولكن لأني أتفق معه في أشياء عديدة، ولكن إما أن نضع هذا الإطار أو أن تكون هناك ضمانات ناجمة عن تحول كبير من الظروف. فالبوسنيين عادوا بعد أن تم تحرير أراضيها
To be fixed.
Is it okay now? Is it okay now?
Is translation working?
Yeah,
Yes.
it is okay.
Ma'am.
Okay.
Very good.
So, in terms of the parallels, and I also want to reflect a little bit after this on this issue of the discourse on return and the framing of the conversation. I think this is why this conference is so important. Before I answer, I will actually touch on that. Here we are constantly talking about a number of people who have voluntarily or otherwise returned to Syria, let's say over the last year. And rightly, we, like Ruba said, these are our brothers and sisters, our children. We have to take their interest as a priority and see what we can do to help them. But nobody mentioned that more people were displaced in the course of the last year from Syria than those who returned. Displacement is still going on by the same sources, same crimes. So if we are not addressing the source of the threat, and this is where my personal experience comes, we are having a wrong conversation. When the Dayton Agreement was signed in November 1995, I lived in New Zealand, across the world from Bosnia. When it was signed in November, I was on my way back home in December. Why? Because there was an agreement that guaranteed my rights. It took me from that moment another 7 years to be able to return. 7 years from that moment when political agreement was in place, basically our version of your safe environment paper, but much less detailed. We didn't have the expertise that you have, we didn't have the experience that you have, but it provided us with the platform to claim our rights back. So in March 1996, I was part of the first delegation from my town that went to negotiate with the authorities that have expelled us, killed us, interned us in concentration camps. Same people. Out of 4 people that we negotiated with, 3 were later convicted of war crimes. The chief of the police, the mayor, and the head of the municipal government. But at that time, We had the agreement that guaranteed our rights. They would, after our meeting, go and bulldoze our cemeteries that we asked to visit, to send us a message that we are not welcome. But we had the agreement, we had the platform to go back. And we were unstoppable, because that platform gave us the right to constantly demand either you fulfill the agreement or we continue to fight. You know, there cannot be, there are consequences of not respecting an agreement. If there is no agreement, and like Alexander said, somebody has to guarantee the security. In Kosovo, it was NATO. NATO said you can return because we are here. Nobody who threatened you before is here anymore. We will protect you. In my opinion, this is the conversation that we have to have. Who and how is going to guarantee the establishment of the safe environment? Because, again, from a personal experience, we returned to ruined houses. We did not wait for houses to be reconstructed to return. We would put nylon over our roofs and live in houses like that for years, not for a few months, for years, until they were reconstructed. But security was the main thing. We would come to clean our houses, come back tomorrow, and landmines were put in the houses that we cleaned. We would remove the landmines and come back again tomorrow, because we were guaranteed our rights under the political agreement. So in terms of what is the importance, of course everybody has the right to voluntarily go even if there are no guarantees. Of course that desperation will make people decide this more than anything else. Of course, everything that Alexander said about the need to protect people in the countries where they sought asylum has to be a priority. The help, the funds has to be a priority. But I think that the conversation about return has to be what is the set of minimum conditions that people will accept in order to be able to go back. So that is what I think this conference is about, this attempt to change the conversation. Because if we are constantly talking about the tiles in the mosaic, while we are completely ignoring what the big picture that these tiles construct, and because it's too complicated, because who is going to do it, because whose interest is it to do it, then we are missing the conversation, because regardless of how hard it is, this is what the solution is, long term. Otherwise, we are constantly, as I said, look at the numbers. People from Dara are twice as many who left through smuggling routes to the north, then to Turkey, then to Europe. You catch almost monthly people from Dara in dinghies in the English Channel, trying to reach the UK. They are more numerous than people who voluntarily return to Syria. If we don't have a conversation that includes both of these factors, we will regret it, in my opinion.
Please do, yes.
Yeah, look, and I want to come back in on the political agreement sort of condition, and thank you. That was. I think we are on the same page. I mean, I know it's not a popular view to say that, but that there doesn't need to be a political agreement. It's coming from the perspective of trying to respect people's individual rights to return, and not put a political condition on them and their choice. But I fully agree that it comes down to the guarantees and there needs to be something which creates that structure, and a political agreement is often the best way. But let me just explain the bit of background to this thought, which is remember in 2018, President Putin announced that, actually, I think it was around that 1 million people should go back by December 2018. We had issued, UNHCR had issued this comprehensive protection solution strategy in February before that announcement, within which there were thresholds which are based on international standards and on discussions with refugees on the conditions they would like to be in place, right? And that document still remains the primary guide for us on the sort of conditions necessary. And it sets out the need for amnesties, the need for guarantees, the need for some sort of mechanism to oversee them. So, but clearly from the Russian side, this was a politicization of refugee return to see large numbers of people come back because of a political agenda. But then, and I'm going to be very popular for saying this, but then the reaction we had from Western governments was the line, no political agreement, no return, which is not, I'm not equating the two, but is also a politicized statement. It wasn't coming from a perspective of, it was about not wanting to be caught into this political game with Russia over reconstruction and all these other things, which I'm not equating. But look, and so this is where we stepped out, and what we've been trying to do ever since is to say, it's not about what the Russians or the West think, it's what do refugees think, what do the Syrians think? And this is where we started these intention surveys systematically, because what we were trying to do was take it away from a political discussion over deciding other people's lives for them into one based on a political agenda, into one which was driven by, okay, this is this person's right, they need to stay in asylum, or they've chosen to go back, but it's this choice, which Ruba mentioned, which is absolutely critical, which we need to protect. But that's why I come from this perspective of saying that it's not a condition for a political agreement, because I don't want to go back into that discussion on politicizing this. But of course, it is an effective way of redefining the relationship between the state and its citizens and providing the guarantees. Of course, it would be preferable. But this is where we come from, because we try and focus on the individual and their choice.
Thanks, Alex. I think we're in a very important discussion. I wonder, Ruba, do you want to come back into any of this, or Marwan as well?
Yes, I just wanted to say that we cannot say it's not a prerequisite because it's politicizing the issue, because the issue is political. The refugee issue is a highly political issue. And the way how it's been used by all governments, including Turkey, it used it as a political card with Europe. By the way, even the batch of return now to Lebanon, it happened before President Aoun left his seat because he wanted this on his record, because he promised his people that I will take the refugees back. So the issue of return is a highly political issue, and Rafiq, I agree with you, but let's remember also that it's great to, to learn from other experiences, but that every experience is very different. So in the case of Afghanistan, even in the case of Bosnia, I think there was some level of trust, but we've tried this this regime. We know what it's like. I remember in one of the receptions not very long ago with a European diplomat, she said to me, "We've got to give this regime a chance." And I was like, really? In 2022? Is it someone we're meeting? Is a brand new entity that we're meeting? So anyway, just to say that we've tried, we've seen in reconciliations when people try to go back to their places of origin, what's happening. We've seen when people have tried to just go back to Syria, what's been happening. But so I do think it's a very important prerequisite, and 2254 has to happen, a political transition has to happen. We cannot give up on any of those things. I stand firmly by this position. However, all I'm saying, Rafi, is that from now until then, the political process has been on a stalemate for how many years now? Nothing's been happening. So from now until then, what do we do? Do we stand there and just wait until there is a political framework that is great? Okay, we want that, and we are fighting for that at the macro level. But on the day-to-day level, we have to start doing things at the community level. We have to start building a monitoring mechanism. We have to continue pushing UNHCR to adjust its protection thresholds about return. We have to keep pushing for a free environment where the media, civil society, and the UN can really monitor those return. We need to understand these return movements better. We need to build a protection network of civil society actors inside Syria that can accompany those who are returning and to understand. So I'm just saying it's not an either-or equation. It's things that we need to be doing in parallel. Thank you.
I'll come back to you in a sec, Rifi. I just want to give Marwan a chance to comment on this part of the discussion or any other things that you wanted to say earlier that I cut you off on.
I just wanted to benefit from the Bosnian experience. What is important, we have to have a project in our minds that is well designed, including or not a political process. We have to be ready, not after the solution. No, I want to draw attention to the potential scenarios if, just in case, the Syrian refugees will be forced to go back. I mean here the neighboring countries. There are this issue of narcotic drugs is being used. For example, Syria has become a drug productive country, not only a transit country. And under the terrible living conditions and bad education, the young people will either be a victim of drugs or a partner in this trade of drugs. On the other hand, if the Syrians will be forcibly returned, there will be so many other problems that will be faced. And we have seen what happened in Istanbul the other day. There are terrorist organizations coming across the borders. So it is in the interest of the neighboring countries for Europe and the States in order to avoid a new wave of displaced persons. Are you ready in Europe to receive new waves? There was an attempt to name Syria as a drug productive country. So the basic thing here is to build or to have, we have to agree as Syrians how to mobilize and to support this idea of having a safe return and a safe environment, and to approach those organizations and countries that would be in our support. Thank you.
Thanks very much. Before opening for any questions or comments, Refik, do you want to come back on Rubis?
Yeah, I just wanted to say two things. One, there was no trust in Bosnia. I think that is why the example is so relevant. Radovan Karadzic was the president of Republika Srpska at the time. You know, the entire criminal structure that has caused the displacement, very much like in Syria, was in place when the agreement was reached, when we started returning. And that is what the power of framework of rights allows for. There were international guarantees. Political agreement has to have certain set of guarantees. And there were international guarantees in place. And I think that this goes to the second point. What we should be doing about the return should indeed be formulated by Syrians. We cannot allow, we absolutely need to help people who are forced to go back, or even those who voluntarily decide to go back without being forced. We should help them. But they are not a definition of return. They are not a definition. Individual return is not a definition of return. That is something that we keep missing and ignoring. These are situations that we need to address, of course, but we have to talk about return to Syria. And this conversation has to be formulated by Syrians, and we need to support however they define how this process should unfold.
Thank you, Refik. I will open the floor. I realise we've gone over time a little bit, so I will try and copy the last issue and give the floor to 5 questions or so. Again, I don't want to cut anyone off, but time is short, so if people can be relatively brief, it would be very much appreciated. I'll start off over here, and then you. Thank you.
السيد الموسى رابط المحامين السوريين الأحرار.
Among the pressures exercised on the Syrian refugees, especially by Lebanon, for the return of Syrians, the UNHCR, and here the representatives are present. They were sending messages, SMS messages on to the Syrians. They were telling them that they would stop the support they are presenting, and they are being told that this financial support will stop as a result of the rare financial resources. So, is this another contribution by UNHCR to support Lebanon and to help Lebanon have this, what they call, voluntary return by the Syrians to Syria from Lebanon?
Thank you for that question. Next one here.
Thank you very much. Actually, Rafiq has almost talked what I want to say, so thank you very much at the last moment. So I don't agree with the issue that the refugees decided to return, and we should support this decision based on our experience and follow up at the Syrian Network for Human Rights. The issue of we notice strong desire is not to return. That based on the percentage of the returnees, only 7% out of 14 millions who's returned. 6% out of those 7% from neighbor countries. And those who's been returned actually returned due to the pressure. And this is type of enforced return. Pressure the refugees via circumstances, not to give, like Lebanon, not give residency, hate speech in Turkey or Jordan or Lebanon, or this is type of forced return. So that based on all those circumstances, those refugees decided some, and small, in spite of all of this pressure and the awful and disaster circumstances in the camps, the percentage is still at the bottom bar. So that giving us an indication that those they don't like to return, and the international law is very clear in this regard actually. So reparation is considered voluntarily only if the refugees is the one who has decided freely whether or not to return, is fully aware of the situation in his country. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Next comment or question from this gentleman here.
مساء الخير.
Good afternoon. My name is Mohammed Al Ahmed. I'm a Syrian professor. I will be very brief. I believe that there is a very serious political phenomenon, geopolitical phenomenon in the north and south part of the Mediterranean Sea. Not only Syria, it is a very painful experience what we witness in Syria, but in other causes, and this might transfer to become a more terrible cases. Europe will be paying the price of such causes, namely the smuggling of migrants and the trials to find decent living for the people coming from these areas. So we have to ask ourselves a very central question. Doesn't Europe pay a humongous price and might force some solutions in the southern part of the Mediterranean? As has been mentioned by Rafiq, and if the Europeans do not press hard to find an opening and a solution for the Syrian cause, it's like as if we are treating the teeth and leaving the heart in pain. And this is the question I'm addressing to Europe. Help us to find a political solution in order to find a solution for this very grave condition.
Thank you very much indeed. Dr. Mazen.
مازن كسيبي من الرابطة السورية لكرامة.
Mazen from the Syrian Association for Citizen Dignity. There has been some mention and some parallel comparison between the case of Bosnia and what is happening in Syria, and I believe that this is wrong. The low percentage of returnees, which amounted to 2% only, has been attributed to some economic factors. Is this due to some economic conditions? On the other hand, you have mentioned that the returnees fear to be in contact with the United Nations. Well, this is a reality, but you, as officials and responsible for the protection of those returnees, is to do something. Why don't you go to the Syrians themselves, be they displaced or returnees? Why don't you ask them, what would you want to have as guarantees for your return? And as has been mentioned, like the text messages that have been sent to some to the Syrians, so we can gather that there is a total indifference by the organization responsible for the refugees. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Mazen. I'm going to just take two more, one from the gentleman here and one from the lady there. So can I take you first of all, please? Yeah.
Talat Sumbuli from the Syrian American Council and the Syrian Association for Citizen Dignity. I like the analogy Rafiq has mentioned in relation to the Bosnian war. And I'm trying to get some ideas that will be able to have some benefit for us as Syrian refugee. During the Bosnian war, when the refugees, the refugee from Bosnia came back to Bosnia, before that, the American plane was working very hard on Bosnia to teach those who did the atrocity that something could be done, and they punished them. In Syria, what we have in Syria is Russia and Iran. So what the international community are willing to do to ensure that those Syrian refugees, even if the Syrian authority gave their permission and acceptance to the criteria for the Syrian refugee to go back to Syria, who is going to enforce it over the Syrian government?
Thank you. And the last comment from the floor here from this lady.
أود أن هالة من رابطة كلامة المواطن. أود أن
My name is Hela. I would like to underline the importance of the time factor. This is not in the interest of the whole region. Mr. Rafiq said that it took him 7 years to return to Bosnia, so we will need a lot of time. Also, the UN agency should make sure that there will be no demographic changes in these areas. And the social cohesion is not being helped. If we are going to change the population in certain areas, this will further complicate the matter. In order to secure the establishment of peace and a political solution, we have to work on based on a comprehensive approach for the whole problem.
Thanks very much indeed. I'll take one more then, since you've put your hand up and caught my eye when I shouldn't have looked at you, but okay.
شكرا. بس الأستاذ السيد الكسندر يعني الأسباب.
Said Mr. Alexander, the reasons behind displacement and the waves of refugees were political, not for seeking food. Actually, there are some families that returned to Aleppo, and the father was later killed. Personally, I am a refugee, and my uncle was killed under a lot of torture. So I hope that the United Nations would not be a part of this enforced return. Thank you.
Thanks very much. I'll close that from the floor now, because I do want to give everyone the chance to either try and address some of these points that have been raised. Some are questions, some are slightly more general observations. I suppose a good number of them Alex probably feels are somewhat directed at him, which is probably not a surprise to him. I think just in general terms, the conversation I think is very interesting in a few different ways, but this discussion, I think, Ruba, you're absolutely right that, you know, drawing comparisons is something that one has to be careful about, but I think the point that Rafiq's making is actually quite important. And one of the conversations that happens, the point that so much of the conditions that still continued to exist in Bosnia at the time of the agreement were anything but positive, in terms of the fact that the perpetrators of a number of atrocities and systematic atrocities remained in power, and that the difference was a framework existing that people could rely on, or felt confident enough to rely on, even if the situation on the ground, as he's described, continued to be fraught with danger. And I think that's an interesting point. because sometimes I get the sense myself that the conversation about a political agreement and people insisting on it, and I don't say Alex was saying this just to be clear, but sometimes one gets the impression that it's dismissed as a kind of naive suggestion or an impractical suggestion, etc., and that the focus therefore goes elsewhere. And I think that there is, I think that's what's at the heart of the paper to a large degree, is to say that we do not have the necessary framework around which we can build our confidence. And that we are not saying, or you are not saying, the people that have drafted this document, that everything has to be perfect and that that Syria is turned into some kind of utopian democracy prior to our return. Very far from it. And I think that's the richness, if you like, from the example, that it's a very realistic and practical and still dangerous. I think that's the point. No one's saying it's not dangerous to go back. In those circumstances, the point is that there is a framework around which confidence can be built. That's what I understood it, but I think there's a very interesting discussion to be continued to be had around there. Alex, I do think most of these points probably come to you, and I'm sure there's a few things you probably want to say in reply to them. So why don't I start with you, to be fair, to give you the lion's share if that's necessary just now, because I guess we want to finish up in about 10 minutes, so I'll give you about 4 or 5 minutes max just now, if that's possible.
And look, let me just address, I mean, I think the tone of many of the questions come with a certain suspicion of UNHCR or a sense that UNHCR is somehow acting in a manner which is not in refugees' interests or is somehow in cahoots or collusion with governments and things like that. Look, and I don't think I'm going to be able to change your view, right? If you've got that view, you know, I understand. I can just say I've been working on this for 10 years. I wrote the CPSS, this Comprehensive Protection Solution Strategy. I've been intimately involved in a lot of conversations with host governments, and you know, at no stage over the last 10 years have I seen a situation where UNHCR has not been designing its response around the interests of refugees. Now, you may not believe that, but that's what my experience over the last 10 years. Now, within that, do we make mistakes? Do we miscommunicate? Yes, probably, and we need to be held to account and do a better job when we do. But there's no sort of evil strategy behind our actions. To the contrary, we're trying to navigate something which is very complex politically. We're not a political organization. I think what we found, the correct approach, the correct moral approach, is to just focus in on what the refugees tell us they want to do, and to really try and drill into that with international standards, but also recognize the challenges with the host governments, to try and find solutions, but in a manner which is guided by those individual refugee voices. Now, again, that's my view of what we do. You may have a different view of us, and I accept that. But when it comes to Lebanon, just quickly through the questions then, the Lebanon rhetoric, couldn't agree more. I mean, this was, the rhetoric by the government was scapegoating refugees for political and economic issues inside Lebanon. I mean, the idea that refugees were smuggling bread or stealing fuel, or, I mean, all of this rhetoric was designed around issues which were about...
كان هناك تنافس على الموارد بين سوريا ولبنان، وهذا أمر خطير، ولقد شهدنا ذلك ولقد التقينا بالسوريين والأمر سيء بالفعل. إذن هل هي استراتيجية متعمدة؟
Refer to the text messages about cash and how we're having to cut cash assistance. It's actually together with, I think UNHCR sent out the message because WFP is having to face their cash program is having to be cut. It's the same with Jordan. You know, they're facing a crisis all around the region, and we stand with them in trying to get fundraisers for them and for our own programs. But this isn't part of a strategy to return people. To the contrary, we're saying we need urgently more money to be able to channel these funds to the refugees through these, well, you know, very efficient cash programs. But we're constantly having to look at this. We're having to decide between, you know, we have all this proxy means testing and interviews with refugees to see who needs the cash. We're picking between people in, you know, who are living well below the poverty line. We're not even assisting those who are just below the poverty line. We're talking about right at the bottom. And it's really, this is where the message is to the international community. We need to step up. But it's not, we're not trying to push people back. We're trying to advocate that there should be more money to be able to give them the choice to decide what to do instead of feeling under pressure. The gentleman here made a point about that the majority don't want to go back. We agree. I mean, we've said that the majority, it's less than 2% want to go back in the near future. I think that the other metric we had was asking people, would you like to go back eventually? Which I think then lines up with the SACD one, right? And that's a higher number, much higher number. And you talked about push factors, and it comes back to the same thing. What is a free, and your depiction of the legal framework is 100% correct. It's, we need to ensure that people are well informed about the risks and the consequences, and they need to have so it's a well-informed and free decision, right? That's the frame we use. And it's very debatable what is a free decision in a context with so many moving factors and push factors. I agree. And I've talked about those in the statement earlier. The gentleman, Mr. Marwan, is it, who mentioned, why don't you go to the Syrians and ask them what they want as guarantees? I think absolutely, and this, I have to correct, this is what we have done. So for the 2018 Comprehensive Protection Solution Strategy, it has 21 protection thresholds. That was done on the basis of intention surveys and discussions and focus groups with Syrian refugees and international standards. And the 21 requirements correspond, I mean, between the two. The international standards are also the things that refugees want: guarantees, amnesty. I need to be able to reclaim my housing, land, and property. I need to be able to go back without sort of risks of fear for my life. It shouldn't just be a sort of a legal frame in principle, but there needs to be like de facto. It has to be applied, and there have to be guarantees to ensure that. They want to have schools, they want to have clinics, they want to be able to put their children have a hope for the future. These are all the things which are also the international standards which guide those protection thresholds. So I have to say, it's not with total indifference, and forgive me if the translation is not quite exact, but we are trying to, and this is actually the entire drive of what we're doing. Again, I'm sorry if it doesn't appear like that from time to time, and I think it says we've got to do a better job of communicating what we do. And again, sometimes maybe we make missteps. That's it, I think. I'm sorry, there was a gentleman here with your uncle, and I'm sorry for that experience. It's, yeah, I mean, these are very real, unfortunately, it's the reality we're facing inside Syria.
Thanks very much indeed, Alex. I'm going to go to Refik because I'd like my Syrian colleagues to have the last word here. So, Refik, can you give us any answers, thoughts, comments to wrap up and try and keep it as brief as you can? Thank you.
Sure. I'll basically, I don't think any questions were directed at me directly, but to simply pick up on what Alexander said, again, what I'm struck with today in this room, in these sessions, in these conversations, is the level of the need for Syrians to have a voice. I think that is, for instance, I think that what Alexander is saying, I have absolute trust that you believe in what you're doing and what you are saying, and that you are doing it from the conviction of a true humanitarian, absolutely. But for instance, we need more transparency, and we need more voices of Syrians to be involved in the conversation. Because, for instance, since 2018, protection thresholds have been watered down. Some of them have been completely removed. And we have taken part in the February workshop on the new regional operational framework, after which we received absolutely no feedback on what was going to happen with the protection thresholds. Or, for instance, the area-based return support, which we hear very troubling information about. We don't know. And that is why I think this is, to me, maybe I'm completely wrong, maybe UNHCR has a different way of consulting, but I think this shows how much need there is to engage robustly, honestly. You know, what does it mean, if, for instance, to have the protection threshold if we are not reporting on them, whether they are being met? I don't think that UNHCR, like you said, has the capacity, but let's invite people who have capacity. Father is here. You know, Syrian Network for Human Rights is absolutely the top organization when it comes to such capacity. There are others, but we have to inform people of what is the reality when they are contemplating, is it better for me to return, however bad situation is, or to stay where I am. So this culture of transparency, I think this conference is ushering in a new era of transparency in this discussion, in my opinion.
Thank you, Rafik. Let me go to Ruba.
I think, Rafik, you read my notes.
Oh, sorry.
No, but I was going to say the same thing. We were part in 2019 of, one of the very few local organizations involved in this protection threshold document, and all of a sudden, a lot of this document changed, and we weren't anymore invited to participate truly in any further advancements. I always say I meet very good people from the UNHCR. That makes me wonder why the organization is, the way it is, because genuinely I know you guys have the best of intentions, but let's not forget that UNHCR in Lebanon, in Syria, they are operating under the mercy of the governments. And I know a few years ago when UNHCR tried to even say that return is not, it's not the time for return, all the working permits in Lebanon were halted. So we cannot say that, we cannot say that the UNHCR is independent or is doing what the Syrians want, because we know it's operating under the state, under the state's mandates in all of these countries. I just want to say another, so basically, yes, cooperation, bringing in stakeholders, having a more participatory approach is a very important thing. The other thing is, I stress on the importance of having this great framework that encompasses all of the elements. The documents that you guys have worked on is a great starting point. But let's continue pushing for guarantors on the international level, because I'll give you just a small example. When the Russian initiative was happening in Lebanon, I was on a panel with the Russian ambassador, and I asked him, what guarantees can you give the people who want to go back in your own initiative, under your own initiative to Syria? And of course the thing he threw back was that Syria is a sovereign state, so after people cross the border, there is nothing that we can do. So if no international entity can provide any guarantees under the pretext of sovereignty, then it's a really difficult thing for us as Syrians. So I think the starting point is really to continue this conversation with all actors, and we do need all actors. We do need the UNHCR, we need the international community, we need the political actors, we need civil society organizations who are outside Syria and inside Syria. So I guess this is just to close on a more positive note of maybe starting a better collaboration and participation of all actors to ensure, because I'm sure that our aim, all of us, is the same on that. Thank you.
Thanks. Before coming to Marwan, I think a 2-second, 2-finger clarification from...
Yeah. So this is an example of perhaps a misstep and some misinformation, right? So on the misinformation side, look, I mean, we do come under pressure from governments. We came under pressure from the Lebanese government about our residency permits maybe 4 years ago when there was a similar thing, and the same thing has happened recently. Right, in the last 6 months we've had the same thing. This doesn't change anything for us. What, so some of our international staff have some difficulties getting a residence document. That doesn't change anything for us. Nor, and especially to the point that, when we are dealing with something which relates to international protection principles and our staff or our organization is being targeted by government for that reason, our backbone stiffens. And I'm sorry, there was no change in any of those cases, because I'm in charge of this, of any of the situations. No, because I find this being like getting persona non grata in UNHCR used to be a badge of honor, frankly. And especially when it's related to, defending principles, and we will stand by that. Now, so frankly, to equate the two is not quite fair, because nothing changed over this whole period during any of those measures. Now, the other thing where there's a misstep by UNHCR, and we do make them. So, again, I authored this comprehensive protection solution strategy. in 2018, there was this regional operations framework, which was authored by other people. I'm trying to defend my organization at the same time. What they did, without proper consideration, was to summarize the protection thresholds in an annex at the back. Now, and then I've seen, I feel, you know, and I realize that this is bad, right? It wasn't anything deliberate or intentional, and I'm sorry to put my hand on my heart and say, like, to accept sort of, if anything, just simply an editing mistake. They thought that they were having to cut it down to be able to summarize, and then that was interpreted as a deliberate change of UNHCR's position. That is terrible communication on the part of UNHCR, and frankly, we have a responsibility not to create confusion, whether it's among you guys, but frankly, for me, the most important is the refugees. We should not create confusion on refugees as to these things. I don't think the refugees read those documents, but I think it's incumbent on us to really try and ensure that our message is clear and consistent and coherent, and please do point out to us when there are mistakes and things like that, but there was no change, absolutely not. The Comprehensive Protection Solution Strategy thresholds are the guiding ones, and I know you go through these awful workshops, but at least I understood from the colleagues who are in charge of this, that they are just simply putting back in the Comprehensive Protection Solution Strategy protection thresholds to make sure that we correct that misstep. But that's what it was.
So knows that.
I know. This is bad communication.
Guys,
clearly, I'm accepting that.
Yeah, we have to wrap this.
But the point is that, so just look, bear with us. Again, I accept the sort of your reactions to then see ill intent or bad intent on the part of UNHCR. I can assure you that's not the case. Where we make missteps, please approach us. We'll try and correct it. I think the most important thing is that the refugees themselves know the policy, know the position, know where we're going, and that we focus in on their voices and their rights.
Okay, thank you, Alex. I had hoped to finish this at around 22, and I want Marwan to have the chance to say his final piece, and then I imagine we'll have to have a slightly shorter break than we had planned. But Marwan, can you give us your final thoughts?
If some questions posed by the participants show some skepticism, some anger, I can assure you that the Syrians inside Syria are having major problems. They have no trust. If we can agree on one definition of the working tools, if we can agree on a framework. As for confidence and trust, they are absent right now. We can understand that some organizations want to work, but the regime is using the current circumstances before us, and that is why we're trying to put and lay down some steps to be taken by the Syrians in one voice in order to implement any political solution. We cannot write the constitution without reaching a safe environment. So the safe environment is a prerequisite. We cannot take and divide parts. I cannot pick and choose. So it is the Syrians' right to live in dignity and to lead a safe life in a safe environment. I thank you.
Marwan, and thank you to all four of you for your contributions, and indeed to all of you on the floor. I thankfully do not have the job of summarising and collating into some coherent thought all of the contributions that have been made, but I would just have a stab at one or two quick observations, conscious of the need to rush to coffee. It's interesting to me. I think two things come through from a number of the observations. I think what I gather from a number of the comments is that when people are talking about trust and confidence, as Marwan just did at the end, and going back to one of the thoughts I had earlier, we're not talking, as far as I can gather, about having total trust and confidence. There is no country in the world that has total trust and confidence in their governments. I speak as someone that comes from the UK at the moment. We're experiencing frequent bouts of a lack of confidence in terms of some of the differences that are going on there. But the issue is in terms of the what's enough. What's the framework that provides enough confidence to move forward, and how can that be generated in the current circumstances? So what's enough confidence? What's the practical ways of getting to that? And that brings us back to the question of whether an agreement of some sort is necessary to do that. And I think the second point that has been made a little bit throughout the conversation, and I think recognised by everyone, including by Alex, is that this is important: communication, feedback, transparency, understanding, getting all of that right. We won't solve all of the issues and perceptions that some people will have, but that's a fundamentally important principle that I think everyone takes on board. So thank you very much indeed for your time just now. I presume we're going to try and come back at 4:15? 4:20 apparently. The half-hour break is important, and I'm advised that smoking is also important. Okay, thank you everyone.
Recording stopped.